Elvis Presley stared at his reflection in the mirror. But it wasn't really him looking back. It was a caricature, a polished, sequined doll with a weary smile plastered on its face. The exhaustion was a constant hum beneath his skin, a dull ache in his bones that no amount of sleep or even a good song seemed to fix anymore. For years now, his life had been a meticulously planned schedule dictated by one man, Colonel Tom Parker. Colonel, with his ever-present cigar and his booming laugh, was more than just a manager. He was a gatekeeper, a puppeteer, and in recent times, a warden. Elvis remembered the early days, how the Colonel had promised him the world, how he delivered on so much of it. The records, the movies, the screaming fans, it had all been a whirlwind of dreams come true. But somewhere along the line, the dream had soured, turning into a repetitive grind, a golden cage with increasingly heavy bars. Las Vegas, every night the same stage, the same sequined jumpsuits, the same set list. The crowd still roared, and Elvis still gave his all, pouring sweat and heart into every performance, but inside, a vital spark was flickering. He missed the raw energy of his early music, the freedom of creating something new, something that truly spoke to him. Instead, he was singing the same hits, churning out forgettable movie after forgettable movie, all greenlit by the Colonel, who saw only dollar signs. "Elvis, darling, you look tired." Priscilla's voice was soft, laced with concern as she entered the dressing room. She moved with quiet grace, her beauty still striking. Even in the dim light, she saw through the practiced smile, past the tired eyes. She always did. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "Just another show, Pris. Another night in paradise." The sarcasm was heavy in his voice. "Sometimes I feel like I'm doing the same thing over and over, like a record stuck on repeat." Priscilla sat beside him on the plush velvet couch. "I know, honey, it's a lot, the Colonel. He just keeps pushing." "He doesn't push," Elvis corrected, his voice flat. "He shoves, he directs, he decides. My input, my feelings, they're just noise to him." He thought about the latest argument. The Colonel wanted him to sign another multi-movie deal, practically back-to-back, with no room for a music project he was passionate about. He laughed when I told him I wanted to cut an album of gospel songs, real gospel. Not just a Christmas special, said it wouldn't sell, that fans wanted Elvis the heartthrob, not Elvis the preacher. The memory chafed. Gospel music was the core of his being, the spiritual anchor that had grounded him since he was a boy. To have it dismissed so carelessly felt like a dismissal of his very soul. Earlier that day, the Colonel had been in rare form, pacing Elvis's suite, a cloud of cigar smoke trailing him. He'd brought up the numbers, the contracts, the sheer volume of money Elvis was making, or rather the money the Colonel was making off of Elvis. "You know, boy," he'd boomed, "I built this empire and made him a king, and kings, they listen to their advisors, especially when those advisors are making them richer than Midas." Elvis had just nodded, too weary to argue. He knew the narrative. The Colonel never let him forget it. He was always reminded of his humble beginnings, implicitly told that without the Colonel, he'd still be driving a truck, singing in honky-tonks. The truth was, Elvis knew he was talented. He knew he worked hard, and he knew deep down that he deserved more respect, more control. "You deserve to be happy, Elvis," Priscilla said, almost reading his mind. "You deserve to do what makes you feel alive." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate longing. "But how he controls everything, my contracts, my finances, even the people around me. It feels like I'm trapped in a gilded cage. Pris, and the key is in his pocket." The Memphis Mafia, his loyal group of friends and cousins, often felt the Colonel's heavy hand, too. They were his bodyguards, his companions, his lifeline to normalcy. But even they walked on eggshells when the Colonel was around. They'd seen the toll it was taking on Elvis, the way he retreated into himself, the way the light in his eyes sometimes seemed to dim. Tomorrow, the Colonel was scheduled to present the final draft of the new movie contract. It was for 3 more films, formulaic musicals designed to sell soundtracks, not challenge him creatively. Elvis had seen the scripts. They were bland, predictable, and utterly uninspiring. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach at the thought of signing away another chunk of his life to these projects. "I can't keep doing this, Pris," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I just can't." Priscilla took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then don't, honey. You're Elvis Presley, the king. You have more power than you think you do." Her words resonated, a small flicker of hope in the darkness. He had power, didn't he? He was the reason the money rolled in. He was the one who stood on stage, who sang the songs, who made the millions cheer. Without him, there was no empire. No Colonel Tom Parker raking in his exorbitant percentage. The thought, once unthinkable, now began to take root. What if he just stopped? The very idea sent a jolt of fear and exhilaration through him. It would be a battle, a massive, messy fight, but was it any worse than the slow, quiet death of his spirit? He stood up, adjusting the collar of his jumpsuit. The stage beckoned, the roar of the crowd already faintly audible. He was about to step out and perform, to once again be the Elvis everyone expected him to be. But as he looked at his reflection one last time, a different resolve hardened his gaze. Colonel might think he held all the keys, but Elvis was beginning to realize something profound. Sometimes you just had to break the lock. The morning after the show, a tense quiet hung over Elvis's penthouse suite at the International Hotel. The usual bustle of the Memphis Mafia was muted, their hushed conversations and cautious movements reflecting the mood of their boss. Elvis sat at the breakfast table, pushing a fork around his plate of untouched eggs, a grim expression on his face. He barely slept. Conversation with Priscilla the night before and his own swirling thoughts had kept him awake. He'd wrestled with his fear, his loyalty, and a growing sense of desperation. He genuinely cared for the Colonel, in a strange, complicated way. The man had indeed opened doors, had propelled him to heights he'd only dreamed of, but the cost had become too high. Suddenly the door burst open and the Colonel strode in, a wide, triumphant grin plastered on his face. He held the stack of papers clutched in one hand, a lit cigar already puffing out thick smoke from the other. "Elvis, my boy, a glorious morning. We have a deal." Elvis flinched at the booming voice, the sudden invasion of his fragile peace. He didn't need to ask what deal, he knew. "That's wonderful, Colonel," Elvis said, trying to keep his voice neutral, even as his stomach twisted. "What exactly have you dealt for me now?" The Colonel barely noticed the bite in his tone. He dropped the papers onto the table with a flourish, sending a spray of crumbs from Elvis's untouched breakfast. 3 more pictures, son, back to back. MGM is thrilled. The money is phenomenal, and you, my boy, are going to be even richer. He clapped Elvis hard in the back, making him wince. 3 more? Elvis repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Colonel, we talked about this. I told you I wanted to break from movies. I wanted to focus on music. Maybe even a live album from Vegas. Something different," the Colonel scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Different? Nonsense. Different doesn't sell, boy. Different means risk. And we don't do risk. We do sure-fire hits. These movies, they're hits. The soundtrack sales alone will be astronomical. Think of the exposure. You'll be on every screen in America." "But I don't want to be on every screen," Elvis said, his voice rising slightly. "I want to make good music. I want to perform. I want to feel like I'm creating, not just regurgitating." The Colonel's grin tightened. "Don't go forgetting who holds the polisher." The words hung in the air, sharp and stinging. A hillbilly with a guitar. The sheer condescension, the belittling dismissal of his talent, his passion, his very essence. It was more than just a jab. It was an attempt to strip him of his identity, to remind him of his supposed insignificance. Without the Colonel's guiding hand, Elvis felt a cold fury begin to simmer in his gut. He had endured so much, overlooked so many insults, bitten his tongue through endless arguments. He had justified the Colonel's greed, his manipulative tactics, his constant need for control, telling himself it was for the best that the man knew what he was doing. But this felt like a betrayal on a deeper level. Pushed back from the table, scraping his chair loudly against the floor. "You think I'm nothing without you?" he asked, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. "You think my talent is just something you polished into existence?" The colonel, taken aback by Elvis's uncharacteristic defiance, puffed out his chest. "Now, Elvis, let's not get emotional. This is business, and business is booming. You should be thanking me, not questioning me." Picked up a pen from the table, pushing the contract papers towards Elvis. "Just sign here. We can announce it by the end of the week. Another feather in our cap." Elvis stared at the contract, then at the colonel's expectant face. He saw not a manager, but an oppressor. He saw not a partner, but a parasite. The exhaustion, the frustration, the years of feeling suffocated. It all culminated in this moment. The words, "a hillbilly with a guitar," echoed in his mind, searing hot. "Colonel," Elvis began, his voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside him. "Do you truly believe that?" The colonel chuckled, oblivious. "Believe what, boy? That you are a diamond in the rough? Of course, and I'm still cutting you into a finer gem." Elvis's hands clenched into fists under the table. This wasn't just about movies or money anymore. This was about his dignity, his worth, his very soul. The constant diminishment, the outright disrespect had finally pushed him past the point of no return. He realized with chilling clarity that if he signed that contract, if he let this insult stand, he would truly lose himself. A flicker of light ignited deep within him. A spark that had been buried under layers of fatigue and manufactured smiles. He had spent his whole life trying to please others, trying to live up to the image the colonel had created for him. But what about the real Elvis? The one who loved music more than fame, who yearned for authenticity, who longed for control over his own life. He looked at the pen, then at the colonel's eager, greedy eyes. Quiet determination settled over him, replacing the anger. He knew what he had to do. The path ahead would be messy, difficult, and terrifying. But the alternative, a life of quiet despair, dictated by a man who saw him as nothing more than a commodity, was far worse. He would not sign. He would not be diminished this time. He would stand. Elvis retreated to his private sanctuary within the suite, the soundproofed music room. He needed space, distance from the colonel's oppressive presence, and a place where he could think. The insult still burned, but beneath the anger, a different emotion was taking root. Resolve. He had to break free. The thought, once a terrifying whisper, was now a roaring conviction. He picked up his guitar, the cool wood, a familiar comfort against his hands. He didn't play a hit song, didn't try to force a melody. Instead, he strummed a few soft chords, letting the notes redded, feeling the vibration through his fingertips. This was his true self, the musician, the artist. This was what the colonel sought to control, to package, to sell, without ever truly understanding its sacredness to Elvis. Priscilla found him there a short while later, her expression worried. "He's gone," she said, referring to the colonel. "He's fuming. Said you were being unprofessional and ingrateful." Elvis simply nodded, still strumming. "Let him fume. I'm through letting him dictate my life, Pris." She sat on the floor beside him, leaning her head against his leg. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not signing that movie contract, and I'm not letting him push me around anymore." He paused, looking at her. "He thinks I'm nothing without him. He said I was a hillbilly with a guitar before he found me." Priscilla gasped, sitting upright. "He said that to your face?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "How dare he? You are the most talented, most natural performer this world has ever seen." "Elvis, he just knew how to capitalize on it. He didn't create you, honey, God did, and your mama and daddy and your own hard work." Her fierce defense filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt. It was true. He had worked tirelessly honing his craft, pouring his soul into every note, every performance. The Colonel had opened doors, yes, but Elvis had walked through them and owned every stage he'd ever stepped on. Later that evening, after the initial shock had worn off, he called Joe Esposito and Jerry Schilling into the room. These were two of his closest friends, confidants who had been with him through thick and thin, through the rise to fame, the Army years, and the Vegas grind. "Boys," Elvis began, his voice serious, "I need to talk to you about something important." He recounted the morning's exchange, the Colonel's insults, and his own realization. "I can't keep doing this. I feel like I'm losing myself. I need to take back control of my life, my career." Joe, ever the pragmatist, frowned. "Elvis, you know how deep the Colonel's claws are in everything. The contracts, the publishing rights, your finances. It's a tangled mess." "I know," Elvis said, his jaw tight. "But I can't live like this anymore. I'd rather walk away from it all than keep being his puppet." Jerry, usually more reserved, spoke up, his voice filled with concern but also unwavering loyalty. "Elvis, if anyone can do it, it's you. You're the king. You've always found a way. We're with you, whatever you decide. You just tell us what you need." Their support was a balm to his troubled spirit. He wasn't alone. He had people who believed in him, not just as a money-making machine, but as a human being, as an artist. "First step," Elvis mused, "is figuring out how to untangle this mess without it destroying everything. We need legal advice, good legal advice." "Not someone on the Colonel's payroll." Joe nodded, already thinking. "I know a few people. We'll have to be careful, though the Colonel has eyes and ears everywhere." The conversation continued late into the night. They discussed strategies, the potential fallout, the risks involved. Fear still gnawed at Elvis, a cold dread of the unknown. Colonel was a formidable adversary, cunning and ruthless. He had built an empire around Elvis, and he wouldn't let it go without a fight. But as they talked, a strange sense of excitement began to bubble up within Elvis. He was planning, strategizing, taking control. For the first time in years, he felt a surge of agency. He was no longer passively accepting his fate. He was actively shaping it. He thought about the future, a future where he could choose his own songs, perform where he wanted, maybe even make a film that actually challenged him. A future where he was Elvis, not just the king as defined by Colonel Parker. The path ahead was daunting, fraught with potential pitfalls. The media would undoubtedly feast on any public conflict. Colonel would likely unleash a barrage of legal threats and personal attacks, but the alternative was a life of quiet surrender, a slow fading into an echo of what he once was. As dawn approached, painting the Vegas sky in hues of orange and purple, Elvis felt a strange sense of peace. He had made his decision. He would stand up for himself, reclaim his life, and finally put the Colonel in his place. The one sentence that would define this new chapter hadn't fully formed in his mind yet, but he knew it would come, and it would be powerful enough to shake the foundations of the empire the Colonel had so carefully constructed. The next few days were a blur of hushed phone calls and clandestine meetings. Elvis and his trusted inner circle, Priscilla, Joe, and Jerry, moved with a newfound stealth, navigating the usually open corridors of the International Hotel. Like spies, they consulted with a lawyer recommended by a trusted friend, someone with a reputation for discretion and a sharp legal mind. The lawyer outlined the immense complexities of Elvis's contracts with the Colonel, which were, as expected, heavily skewed in Parker's favor. It wouldn't be easy. Meanwhile, the Colonel was noticeably absent from Elvis's daily routine, a fact that both relieved and unnerved Elvis. It was the calm before the storm. Elvis knew the Colonel wasn't idly sulking. He was likely devising his next move, perhaps even preparing to strong-arm Elvis back into line. The silence was a palpable tension. Elvis used this time to solidify his resolve. He spent hours in the music room, not just strumming but writing. He started crafting new melodies, feeling the creative spark reignite within him. Pulled out old lyrics, half-finished ideas from years ago, breathing new life into them. This was the real Elvis, the one the world hadn't seen enough of lately. He also spent more quality time with Priscilla and Lisa Marie, cherishing the quiet moments away from the glare of the spotlight. He realized how much of his personal life had been sacrificed to the relentless grind of his career, how much he'd allowed the Colonel to dictate his very existence. "Are you sure about this, Elvis?" Priscilla asked him one evening, her voice tinged with worry. "He's going to fight you every step of the way." "I know, Pris," Elvis said, taking her hand. His gaze was steady, determined. "But I can't live like this anymore. It's draining me. I'm tired of feeling like a product, not a person. I need to be free to be myself, to make my own choices." He looked at their daughter, sleeping peacefully in her crib. "I want to be able to look at her and know I fought for my own happiness, not just for the next paycheck." His friends observed the transformation in him. The weariness was still there, but beneath it a strength. A fire had been rekindled. He was more focused, more assertive. He still had moments of doubt, moments when the sheer enormity of what he was attempting would wash over him, threatening to drown him in fear. But then he would remember the Colonel's words, a hillbilly with a guitar, and the resolve would harden once more. The lawyer had advised them to keep everything quiet until Elvis was ready to make a definitive move. Public spat would be disastrous for his image and potentially tie him up in endless legal battles. Elvis needed to deliver his message directly to the Colonel without warning and make it utterly clear. He began to formulate the exact words he would use. It couldn't be an angry outburst. It had to be firm, definitive, and leave no room for argument or manipulation. It had to be a statement of intent, a declaration of independence. He rehearsed lines in his head, discarding them, refining them. He wanted to convey that this wasn't an emotional tantrum, but a calculated decision born of necessity. A few days later, a message arrived from the Colonel, delivered by one of his own assistants. "The Colonel requests your presence for a meeting tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., sharp. In the penthouse conference room. He says it's time to vacate engagement." Elvis read the note, a small grim smile playing on his lips. This was it. Colonel, confident in his power, was summoning him, expecting him to fall back in line to meekly sign the contracts. He was oblivious to the shift that had occurred within Elvis, the quiet revolution brewing. "Looks like the calm is over," Joe said, looking at the note over Elvis's shoulder. "He's coming in hot, expecting you to roll over." "Not this time," Elvis said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "This time he's in for a surprise." He spent the rest of the day in quiet contemplation, going over every possible scenario, every counter-argument the Colonel might throw at him. He knew the Colonel would try to charm, to bully, to guilt-trip. He would bring up the past, the money, the fans, anything to regain control. Elvis had to be ready. He thought about the one sentence. It had to be clear, concise, and unambiguous. It had to be the kind of statement that cut through all the noise, all the years of control, and stated a simple, undeniable truth. It was more than just words. It was a line in the sand, a declaration of a new beginning. As the Vegas lights glittered outside his window, Elvis felt a strange mixture of apprehension and liberation. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow, the king would reclaim his throne, not on a stage, but in his own life. The conference room felt unusually cold that morning despite the desert heat outside. Plush chairs, the gleaming mahogany table, the framed photos of Elvis, all seemed to mock the tension that crackled in the air. Elvis arrived promptly at 9 a.m., dressed not in his usual casual attire, but in a crisp, dark suit. It was a subtle signal of his seriousness, a quiet declaration that this was not just another casual discussion. The Colonel was already there, puffing on his cigar, a stack of papers meticulously arranged before him. He was dressed in his trademark, gaudy suit, a wide, confident smile on his face. He clearly expected this to be a quick, perfunctory meeting, a signing ceremony. "Elvis, my boy, right on time," the Colonel boomed, rising to shake his hand with a powerful grip. "Glad to see you're ready to get back to business. These movie studios, they're clamoring for you. We've got a wonderful package here." He gestured to the contracts. Elvis sat down. "Colonel, we need to talk." The colonel chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Talk? We can talk after you sign. Plenty of time for talk when the ink is dry. Then we can discuss your next Vegas residency, maybe even a European tour. Imagine the money, Elvis, the crowds." "No," Colonel Elvis interjected, his voice firm, cutting through the colonel's usual bluster. "We need to talk now before anything else." The colonel's smile faltered slightly. He narrowed his eyes, sensing the shift in Elvis's demeanor. "What's wrong, boy? Had too many of those peanut butter and banana sandwiches, getting a little emotional." His tone was condescending, an attempt to belittle and control. Elvis took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was it. He had prepared for this moment, for the colonel's attempt to deflect and dominate. He wouldn't let him. Colonel Elvis began, his voice clear and resonant, filling the room. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, the opportunities you've created, the career we've built together." He saw a flicker of triumph in the colonel's eyes, as if Elvis was about to back down. But Elvis wasn't done. "Things have changed. I've changed. And this constant pressure, this control, it's no longer working for me." "Control? What are you talking about, boy?" "I'm guiding you. I'm protecting your interests. Nobody understands this business like I do. Without me, you'd be lost, remember? Where you came from, Elvis, a nobody." "You didn't make me a star," Colonel Elvis countered, his voice rising, a flash of the old fire returning to his eyes. "I worked for it. I sang, I performed, I poured my heart and soul into every show. Every song. You opened some doors, yes, but I walked through them, and I filled every room, sold every record, sold every riff. This is ridiculous. This is ingratitude. After all I've done for you, you sit here and accuse me?" He slammed his hand on the table. "You're confused, Elvis. You're tired. Sign the contracts. We'll forget this little outburst ever happened." He pushed the papers towards Elvis, his pen already uncapped. Elvis looked at the contracts, then at the colonel's angry, demanding face. The decades of subservience, of letting himself be managed, manipulated, and ultimately diminished, flashed before his eyes. He saw the toll it had taken on his health, his happiness, his very spirit. The words he had crafted, the sentence he had honed in his mind, rose to his lips. He looked the colonel directly in the eye, his voice resonating with a power and conviction the colonel hadn't heard in years. It wasn't angry, not exactly, but it was firm, unwavering, and utterly decisive. It cut through the colonel's bluster, his control, his entire persona. Colonel Elvis said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "My life and my music are mine to command from this day forward." The words hung in the air, echoing in the sudden silence of the room. The colonel froze, his cigar halfway to his lips. His jaw dropped. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, widened in genuine shock, then narrowed into slits of disbelief and dawning fury. He had expected a plea, a negotiation, perhaps even a tantrum, but not this. Not a calm, definitive declaration of independence, not a statement that cleanly severed his perceived hold. The shock on the colonel's face was almost comical, if the situation weren't so gravely serious. It was as if Elvis had just pulled the rug out from under his entire world. And in a way he had. The silence in the room stretched thick with the weight of Elvis's words. The colonel, for perhaps the first time in his career, seemed utterly speechless. His face, usually so animated, was a mask of disbelief, then a slow crimson flush of rage. "What did you say?" The colonel finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse, disbelieving. Elvis didn't flinch. He met the colonel's furious gaze head-on. "You heard me, Colonel. My life and my music are mine to command. From this day forward. That means I make the decisions, not you." The colonel exploded. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the coffee cups. "This is outrageous. This is insubordination. After everything I've done for you, you dare to speak to me like that. You're nothing without me. Elvis, nothing. I control your contracts, your finances, your very career. You can't just command anything. Those contracts are being reviewed, Colonel Elvis stated, his voice still steady despite the colonel's outburst. He was playing his trump card, revealing the legal groundwork he'd been laying. And my lawyers believe there are significant you, there are. Sorely mistaken. The fans come to see me, Colonel. They buy my records. They fill the seats for my shows. Without me, there is no empire. There is no money, and there is no king. He staggered back, his face paling, the color draining from his features. The idea that Elvis had been consulting lawyers, had been quietly building a case against him, clearly hadn't occurred to him. He was accustomed to total, unquestioning obedience. You ungrateful fool. The colonel roared, his voice cracking with fury and a hint of desperation. He snatched up the movie contracts, tearing them in half with a furious rip. Fine, you want to be independent? You want to ruin everything? Go ahead. See how far your command gets you. You'll be back begging, mark my words. You'll be back crawling on your hands and knees when you realize you can't survive without me. Threw the shredded contracts onto the table, his eyes blazing with hatred, and stormed towards the door. But before he left, he paused, turning back to Elvis, his voice dripping with venom. You've made the biggest mistake of your life, Elvis, the biggest. You just threw away everything. With that, he yanked the door open and disappeared, leaving it to slam shut behind him with a resounding bang that vibrated through the room. Silence fell once more, heavier this time. Elvis remained seated, exhaling slowly, a tremor running through his body. It was done, the words had been spoken. The line drawn, Priscilla rushed into the room. He looked at her, then a small, shaky smile touched his lips. I'm okay, Pris. It's done. I said it. Joe and Jerry also entered, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, Joe commented, referring to the colonel's exit. He probably thought he had, Elvis said, leaning back in his chair, feeling an immense wave of exhaustion wash over him, followed by an equally immense sense of relief. The weight, the crushing weight of years of control had been lifted, if only for a moment. What happens now? Jerry asked, looking at the torn contracts on the table. Now, Elvis said, pushing himself up, feeling a strange new lightness in his limbs. Now we start over, on my terms. He looked at his friends, his eyes shining with a newfound determination. It's going to be messy. He's not going to make it easy, but it's worth it. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe. The practicalities would be daunting. The legal battles, the financial disentanglement, the public relations nightmare. It would be a monumental task. But as Elvis looked out the window at the vibrant Las Vegas skyline, he saw not a golden cage, but a landscape of possibilities. He had faced his greatest fear, stood up to his oppressor, and declared his freedom. The aftermath would be challenging, but he felt a sense of empowerment he hadn't known in years. The king was finally reclaiming his kingdom. The fallout was immediate and predictable. The colonel, true to his nature, retaliated swiftly and ruthlessly. Within days, the media was buzzing with rumors. Vague accusations of contractual disputes and personal disagreements began to surface, carefully leaked by the colonel's camp, designed to cast Elvis in a negative light. An ungrateful star, a spoiled talent. Lawyers quickly became a constant presence in Elvis's life. Colonel's attorneys launched a barrage of legal threats demanding adherence to existing contracts, threatening injunctions to prevent Elvis from performing or recording new material outside of his control. It was a dizzying, overwhelming maze of legal jargon and financial complexities. He's trying to tie us up in knots, Elvis, his new lead lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named M.S. Davies, explained one afternoon. He's hoping you'll get frustrated, give up and come crawling back. That's not going to happen, Elvis said, his jaw set. He had expected this. The colonel's tactics were transparent. The Memphis Mafia stepped up, forming a protective shield around Elvis. They intercepted calls, screened visitors, and managed the flow of information. They saw the toll the stress was taking on him, the sleepless nights, the bouts of anxiety, but they also witnessed his unwavering resolve. This was different from past frustrations. This was a fundamental fight for his soul. One particularly difficult day, a major record label, under pressure from the Colonel, put a temporary hold on the release of some of Elvis's upcoming material, citing unforeseen circumstances. It was a direct hit, aimed at stifling his creativity and income. Elvis felt a surge of frustration, but instead of succumbing to despair, he channeled it. "Fine," he declared, walking into his music room. "They won't release my music. I'll just make more better music. Music I want to make." He dove back into songwriting and recording with an almost manic intensity. He brought in different musicians, explored new sounds, and experimented with arrangements. He'd always wanted to try, but had been forbidden by the Colonel's rigid commercial demands. He found joy in the process, a pure, unadulterated passion that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Priscilla was his rock, offering quiet support and unwavering belief. She reminded him of his strength, listened to his frustrations, and celebrated every small victory. "You're finding your voice again, honey," she told him one evening, watching him hunched over a guitar, humming a new melody. "Not just for singing, but for yourself." The Colonel, increasingly desperate, tried other tactics. He attempted to contact Elvis directly, sending a flurry of telegrams and making phone calls that were quickly intercepted. He even showed up at the hotel lobby once, trying to force his way up, only to be politely but firmly turned away. "By Joe, he's losing it," Elvis Joe reported, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "He's not used to anyone standing up to him." Elvis knew the Colonel was formidable, but for the first time he saw the man's weakness, his absolute reliance on Elvis. Without the king, the Colonel was just a manager. Without a star, a carnival barker with no main attraction. The legal battles continued a slow, grinding process, but Elvis was firm. He would not back down. He learned to trust his own instincts, to make his own decisions even on the smallest details of his career and personal life. He chose the wardrobe for his next public appearance, selected the songs for a small private recording session. He arranged and even started scheduling his own time off. These were small victories, but each one chipped away at the long-held chains. He also started connecting with people he hadn't truly spoken to in years. Old friends from Memphis, musicians he admired, even some former Hollywood contacts who had seemed too afraid to cross the Colonel. He found a network of support he hadn't realized was there. People who respected him as an artist and a man, not just a commodity. The future was still uncertain, but the immediate pressure had eased. Elvis was actively fighting for his freedom, and that act of fighting itself was a powerful tonic. He might be navigating troubled waters, but for the first time in years he felt like he was steering his own ship. The destination was still unclear, but the journey was finally his own. Months turned into a year, and the legal battles between Elvis and the Colonel continued a slow, intricate dance between high-powered lawyers. Colonel, realizing Elvis was not going to back down, had become less publicly aggressive, shifting to a more subtle campaign of attrition. He still tried to interfere, but his power was clearly waning. The hold he once had was visibly loosening. During this time, Elvis embarked on a transformation. Consciously stepped away from the intense Vegas residency schedule. His new legal team had negotiated a temporary hiatus, much-needed break from the relentless grind. It was a difficult decision, financially and professionally, but Elvis knew it was essential for his well-being. He spent his time doing things he genuinely loved. He returned to Graceland, finding solace in its familiar halls, in the company of his family and close friends. He bought a new ranch in Mississippi, away from the glare of Hollywood and Vegas, where he could ride horses, walk in nature, and simply breathe. He reconnected with the land, with simplicity. With himself musically, he soared. He recorded an album of blues and gospel numbers, a passion project he dreamed of for years. He chose every psalm, every musician, every note. There was no Colonel hovering, no demands for commercial appeal, no pressure to fit a specific image. The result was raw, authentic, and deeply soulful. When it was quietly released, it wasn't a blockbuster, but it resonated deeply with critics and a devoted segment of his fan base who praised its honesty and artistic integrity. This is the Elvis we've been waiting for. One music critic wrote, "Unshackled and pure." Praise not just for his talent, but for his newfound freedom, warmed Elvis's heart. He felt a connection to his music he hadn't experienced since the early days. He wasn't just performing, he was creating, expressing, sharing a part of his soul. He also made a conscious effort to improve his physical health. Constant pressure and late nights under the Colonel's management had taken a toll. He started exercising regularly, eating healthier, and cutting back on some of the less beneficial habits he'd developed. He felt lighter, more energetic, and the weary lines around his eyes began to soften. The Colonel, meanwhile, faded further into the background. His desperate attempts to regain control grew increasingly feeble. He threatened lawsuits, leaked false stories to the tabloids, and even tried to recruit some of Elvis's old associates against him, all to no avail. His power was derived from Elvis's complicity, and with Elvis no longer compliant, the Colonel's influence crumbled. There was one last rather pathetic attempt at reconciliation from the Colonel. He sent a lengthy, rambling letter to Elvis, full of thinly veiled threats and nostalgic appeals, trying to remind Elvis of their shared past and hinting at his own declining health. He painted himself as a lonely, misunderstood figure still seeking to protect Elvis. Elvis read the letter, felt a pang of something akin to pity, but no longer the old guilt or obligation he had moved on. He simply passed the letter to his lawyer, who handled it with a polite but firm rejection. "He's trying to tug at your heartstrings, Elvis, MS," Davies had said, "but remember why he made this decision. It was necessary." Elvis did remember. He remembered the insults, the control, the suffocating feeling. He had made the right choice, a difficult choice, but one that had saved him. He even began to consider acting again, but on his own terms. He was reading scripts for more serious, character-driven roles, the kind he'd always wanted to play but had been denied by the Colonel's insistence on formulaic musicals. The idea of truly stretching his acting muscles, of exploring new artistic territory, filled him with genuine excitement, not dread. The transformation was clear to everyone around him. Elvis was happier, healthier, and radiating a calm confidence that had been missing for years. He was no longer just the king, the icon, the product. He was Elvis, a man taking command of his own destiny and thriving in the newfound freedom. With the Colonel's influence steadily diminishing and the legal battles moving towards a more manageable, if still slow, resolution, Elvis found himself experiencing a profound sense of healing. It was as if a heavy shroud had been lifted, allowing him to truly see the world and himself. With fresh eyes, he deepened his connections with those who truly mattered. Time with Priscilla and Lisa Marie became his most cherished moments. He was present, truly present, no longer distracted by the constant demands and anxieties imposed by the Colonel. He would spend hours playing with Lisa Marie, reading to her, taking her on quiet walks around Graceland, enjoying the simple joy of fatherhood without the weight of impending, dreaded movie shoots or exhausting concert demands. His relationship with Priscilla blossomed in this new freedom. They could openly discuss their dreams, their fears, their future, without the lurking shadow of the Colonel's interference. They traveled together not for work, but for pleasure, exploring places Elvis had always wanted to see, but never had the time or permission for. He rediscovered the joy of shared laughter, quiet intimacy, and a partnership based on mutual respect and love. The Memphis Mafia also thrived in this new environment. They were still his loyal companions, but their roles shifted from merely facilitating the Colonel's demands to supporting Elvis's genuine desires. They became his sounding board for new musical ideas, his companions on spontaneous adventures, and his quiet protectors as he navigated his new independence. They saw the dramatic improvement in his well-being and were fiercely proud of him for standing his ground. Elvis dedicated more time to his spiritual growth. He read, meditated, and spent hours in quiet contemplation, reconnecting with the deep faith that had always been a part of him. He visited churches not for publicity, but for personal solace, finding peace in the hymns and sermons. This renewed spiritual grounding further solidified his sense of self and purpose. He often reflected on his past relationship with the Colonel. There was no lingering bitterness, but a clear-eyed understanding. He acknowledged the Colonel's role in his initial success, the shrewd business decisions and the promotional genius, but he also recognized the toxic nature of their dynamic, the slow erosion of his autonomy, and the ultimate necessity of the break. He understood that sometimes even beneficial relationships could become detrimental when they stifled personal growth and happiness. "He did a lot for me, I won't deny that," Elvis admitted to Jerry one day as they sat on the porch at Graceland watching the sunset. "But he forgot something important. He forgot I was a person, not just a product, and he almost made me forget it too." Jerry nodded. "You got it back, Elvis. You fought for it. That's what matters." Elvis nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He had indeed fought, and he had won something far more valuable than wealth or fame: his freedom and his sense of self. He was making choices now based on what felt right to him, not what would line someone else's pocket. He took up new hobbies: photography, collecting vintage cars, even dabbling in painting. These pursuits were simply for pleasure, for the joy of discovery and creation, without any external pressure or commercial expectation. He found a quiet satisfaction in these activities, realizing how much of his life had been consumed by the relentless demands of his career. The media, initially confused by his break from the norm, began to shift their narrative. They saw a revitalized Elvis, a more relaxed and authentic superstar. His recent blues gospel album garnered more attention, with critics praising his vulnerability and depth. His rare public appearances were met with renewed enthusiasm, as fans sensed a genuine peace and happiness radiating from him. The heartwarming aspect of the story was fully realized in Elvis's personal transformation. He was not just the king, but a man who had rediscovered his joy, his purpose, and his authentic self. The decision to stand up to the Colonel, born out of desperation, had ultimately led him to a path of profound personal growth and fulfillment. He was healing, truly healing, from years of being controlled, and the future, for the first time in a long time, felt truly his own. The legal entanglements with the Colonel eventually, after years of painstaking work, reached a settlement. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't without cost, but it finally severed the ties, giving Elvis full control over his career, his catalog, and his future earnings. Colonel, a diminished figure, retreated into obscurity. His empire crumbled, unable to thrive without his star. Elvis, however, flourished. He never returned to the relentless Vegas grind that had nearly broken him. Instead, he chose a different path, one that balanced his passion for music with his desire for a fulfilling personal life. He embarked on carefully selected tours, choosing smaller venues that allowed for a more intimate connection with his audience. He performed with a renewed vigor, a playful energy, and a deep emotional resonance that thrilled his fans. He continued to record albums that truly spoke to his heart. He delved deeper into blues, country, and gospel, exploring musical genres that resonated with his soul. These albums, while perhaps not reaching the dizzying commercial heights of his earlier hits, were critically acclaimed and deeply loved by his dedicated fan base. They showcased a maturity, a depth, and an authenticity that had been stifled for too long. His film career also took a new direction. He carefully chose 2 dramatic roles in independent films, roles that allowed him to truly act, to stretch his emotional range. The films were modest successes, but they earned him respect as an actor, a dream he'd always harbored. He loved the creative process, the collaboration, and the challenge of bringing complex characters to life. More importantly, Elvis was healthier and happier than he had been in years. The dark shadows of exhaustion and frustration that had once haunted his eyes were gone, replaced by a clear, bright light. He laughed more easily, his iconic smile genuine and unforced. He was present for his family, a devoted husband to Priscilla, and a loving, engaged father to Lisa Marie. Their home, Graceland, truly felt like a sanctuary of peace and happiness. One evening, after a particularly joyous and spontaneous jam session in his music room at Graceland, surrounded by friends, a profound sense of contentment washing over him. The room was filled with laughter, the sweet scent of good food, and the easy camaraderie of loved ones. His guitar lay nearby, ready for the next song. He thought back to that pivotal morning in the Vegas suite, the anger, the fear, the desperation that had led him to utter those defining words. He had been on the precipice of losing himself, of becoming entirely consumed by a machine he no longer controlled. But he had found the courage to speak up to reclaim his life. "You know," he said softly, turning to Joe and Jerry, who were sharing a quiet conversation by the fireplace, "it was the hardest thing I ever did, telling him off like that, walking away from what felt like everything." Joe nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "We know, boss." "But look at you now, Elvis," Jerry added, a wide smile on his face. "You're back, the real Elvis, happier than I've seen you in years." Elvis looked at his wife, who smiled back, her eyes full of love and pride. He looked at his daughter playing nearby, utterly carefree. He looked at his friends, his loyal family, and he knew deep in his heart that it was true. Colonel had pushed him too far, driven him to the brink, but in doing so, he had inadvertently given Elvis the impetus he needed to save himself. That one sentence, spoken with such quiet conviction, had been more than just a dismissal. It had been a declaration of rebirth. Elvis Presley. The King was not just a title anymore. It was a reflection of a man who had faced his demons, reclaimed his spirit, and now commanded his own destiny, not with force, but with authenticity, joy, and an unwavering love for his life and his music. He was truly free, and the music he made now, the life he lived, sang louder than any command. The King was reborn, and his reign finally on his own terms had never been more magnificent.